This is Larry Harnisch with yet another Steve Hodel reaction video. This one is for Most Notorious, and it's interesting that this podcast was done about 6 years ago because Steve hasn't embellished his story nearly as much as he does now. It's pretty remarkable how much he has added in the last 6 years. He doesn't engage in his what I call map torture, in which a body is left here to point to there, or a street name is chosen because it indicates something else, like Elizabeth Short's body being found off Degnan. That is apparently more recent. Of course, I haven't done part 2 yet. He may still do that, but so far. As usual, Steve has a very friendly host and softball questions. The host is 100%, yeah, this is amazing, this is great, it's incredible, blah, blah, blah. Again, and I cannot say this enough, the killing of Elizabeth Short and the killing of Jean French are unrelated, totally unrelated. They're totally different. They have nothing in common other than Steve Hodel trying to link them. Now, I did pretty well, in case you're wondering, I did pretty well in Steve Hodel bingo. I didn't get 5 in a row, but I have a couple of 4 in a row. This is Larry Harnisch with another Steve Hodel reaction video. It's raining hard in Los Angeles, so what better way to spend a rainy Sunday morning than making fun of Steve Hodel? This is a 2-part podcast with Most Notorious, and it was done a few years ago, so I thought it would be fun to see how Steve has changed his story over the years, because yes, Steve Hodel changes his story all the time. If you haven't listened to him regularly, you would be surprised. Now, it's not clear exactly when this interview was done. In one place, it's listed as 2020. Another place, it says 2019. On Spreaker, the one I'm using, it says 6 years ago, which would be 2016. Most Notorious is ranked 100th in history podcasts. Not in true crime, weirdly enough, or in general podcasts. Just so you understand, I always do this cold. I have not listened to this ahead of time. I never know exactly what Steve is going to say, although he generally follows his usual script word for word. Then again, he'll go off on some weird tangent. You never know. He's usually so predictable that I play Steve Hodel bingo. So we'll see how he does. Steve Hodel is thin-skinned and can't stand to be challenged. So I'm assuming this is going to be the usual softball questions from a friendly host. Wow. And that one weird thing did your dad do? That's amazing. And he did what? What other weird thing did your dad do? That kind of thing. That's generally the caliber of interviews that you get. And of course, these appearances are all about buying Steve Hodel's books. Okay. Remember, Steve Hodel lies. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. Every word out of that mouth is a lie. So, this is an hour podcast, so with my snarky comments, it should run about 90 minutes. And with that, let us share the screen, and away we go. Alrighty, here we are, the 1947 Black Dahlia Murder Part 1, Steve Hodel, from 6 years ago. And just going to warn you, if there is music on this podcast, I will talk over it so I don't get a copyright strike. So if I do a lot of stuff like that, it's to avoid the copyright strike. Okay, here we go.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/mono. That's MONO. over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPad,
Yada, yada,
Android,
yada, yada,
Kindle,
yada.
or MP3.
Yada, 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 yada.
And please remember that this podcast contains adult themes and listener discretion is advised.
Oh, goody, it's spooky, spooky music that I'm going to talk over so I don't get a copyright strike. Yada, 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 yada. Ooh, oh, now it's spooky ragtime music. La 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 la. Oh, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. I don't care about spooky ragtime music. Why are we doing this? Oh, come on. Let's go. Oh, come on. Gee whiz. Oh, come on.
Welcome to the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Our episode today is about the most notorious murderer in Los Angeles history.
Ooh.
The subject of countless books, movies, theories, lots of intense speculation.
Intense.
The victim is a woman who has gained far more infamy in death than she ever hoped to achieve.
Oh! Far more famous in death than she wanted to be in life. Yeah, that's the usual trope. The aspiring actress who comes to LA, comes to Hollywood, wants to be famous, and in death becomes more famous or becomes as famous as she wanted to be in life. Yeah, I can see where this is going to go. Cliche city. Eric, you're not impressing me so far. Eric?
Slandered, but her mysterious killer has been almost glorified in American crime mythology.
The killer has been almost glorified? Oh, I think this is Steve Hodel talking about his evil genius dad.
Formidable evidence that makes a stunning argument for who the killer really was, his father.
Yeah, no. A friendly host with softball questions. Eric, not impressed. Not impressed.
Homicide detective. He is also a New York Times and international best-selling author. His book, Black Dahlia Avenger, was nominated by the Mystery Writers of America.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to guess that you can self-nominate. I haven't researched that one, but if it's like the Pulitzers, you can self-nominate. So, yeah, maybe not such a big deal. If he'd won, that would be different. Okay.
Good to be with you, Eric.
Good to be with you, Steve. Let the lying begin.
Before we get to the actual Black Dahlia murder.
Oh, tell us something about your dad. Or something about yourself. Let's see, 300 Solves, Homicide Detective, Part of a New Breed. I think that's where we're going to go first.
A murder or even a series of murders, but it's about you and the relationship with your father.
I love my father.
Who you have proven is the murderer of...
No, he hasn't proved that. Eric, come on, man. You could at least try.
A bit short. But I want to ask you, before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind talking about your own life, how you grew up, and how you came to join the LAPD.
Part of the New Breed.
Sure. Basically born in Los Angeles in 1941.
That's actually true.
I had two brothers, and I kind of bounced all around. The first 10 years of my life, we lived with my father, who was a Dr. George Hodel.
Okay, no, that's already a lie. Steve and his brothers, Steve's parents had split up, and most of the time Steve and his brothers were living with the mom, and the mom moved all over Los Angeles. She had a drinking problem, to say the least. She eventually went to jail for child neglect, for neglecting Steve and his brothers. So it's utter BS to say, oh, the first 10 years of my life were at the Sowden house, the Franklin house. That didn't happen. So already Steve is lying. He should say we were the three princes, but let's see if we'll get into that.
County Health, and a little bit later I can go into some heavy biographics on him, because he
was a remarkable man. He had a remarkable life.
Obviously, to understand this whole story, it's important to understand my father and his life. But basically, my mother had been married to the famous film director John Huston, who many of your
he wasn't famous then, though.
Listeners may be familiar with. He had a lot of The African Queen, Treasure of Sierra Madre, Maltese Falcon, all sorts of classic films. And my mother had been married to John, who had been a friend of my father's as
I'm not really sure how much John Huston and George Hodel knew each other in reality. I know what Steve claims, but in reality, no, I'm not so sure about that.
And she divorced him after about 7 years of marriage.
Wait a minute. She divorced him? I thought he divorced her. I mean, that's kind of a fine point, but I mean, I don't think it was her decision to break up the marriage. I think that was Huston's. I don't know. You can't check everything with Steve, but I think that's how it played out.
And married my father. And soon after that, 4 sons were born to her. My older brother, Michael, was born in '39. He grew up to become quite a well-known radio announcer with KPFK.
Yeah, he was the underground hippie announcer, is who he really was. And since Steve mentioned, well, it's okay. Let's have Steve go on. I wonder if he's going to mention his twin brother who died very early on.
Local FM station here, and kind of dedicated his life to public service and the underdogs of life. Then I came along in '41. My younger brother Kelvin came along in '42. Actually, I was a twin. John was only survived like 3 weeks. We were premature 3-pound babies. So basically grew up in the LA Hollywood area, lived in this wonderful kind of Mayan temple.
We were the three princes. Let me point out that the Franklin house, the Sowden house, whatever Steve is going to call it, his dad never owned that house. It was owned by Steve's grandfather, who was George Hill Hodel Sr. It was a rental, okay? You look at the history of the house, all kinds of people had been in and out of that house. It was this weird white elephant in Hollywood. And then his dad came in and lived there for a while, but it was a rental. His dad never owned that house. And I should point out also that the house as you see it today is after a renovation of more than $1 million. So it didn't look necessarily exactly that way at the time. If you want to, you could. There are historic photos of that house as it was at the time. It didn't look like that now. It didn't look the way it does now. Okay.
Then my father left for the film. Actually, he left for Asia suddenly, and
oh, did he? Did he leave for Asia suddenly? Let's talk about what really happened, Steve, since you're not going to get into that. Steve's half-sister Tamar accused George Hodel of molesting her, and he was found not guilty, but she had succeeded in trashing his reputation to the point that the closest job he could get was in Hawaii, which was an American territory at that time. So George Hodel went to Hawaii for a while. And then, he got married when he was in Hawaii, and then he got married again and went to the Philippines. And that's what really happened. I don't know how much of that story you're actually going to get from Steve, but that's what actually happened in reality.
There were the 3 boys and mom, and we kind of bounced around, and I talk about this in my book as the gypsy years. bounced around in different areas of Los Angeles.
That's actually true. Now, I wonder if he is going to say that everything was going swimmingly, because that's how Steve Hodel says it now. Everything was going swimmingly. There was a knock on the door all of a sudden, and it's the cops there to arrest George. So let's see.
Kind of, she was struggling to take care of 3 boys. She was an alcoholic, but also a screenwriter. So.
Yeah, she was kind of a screenwriter. The Motion Picture Academy Library has her letters to John Huston. Mostly she's asking him for money. There's a couple of really goofy ideas. She did, for script, she did sell, I think, a radio show. In the news stories about her going to jail for child neglect, she's billed as a children's author. So she was kind of a one. I mean, she had a very marginal career as a writer. No big deal.
At 17, I decided I wanted to get off on my own and join the Navy. And right at 17, got her permission, was in for 4 years. Got out and thought.
Part of the new breed.
I was a corpsman in the Navy. And when I got discharged, I took a job at a Kaiser hospital here as an orderly, thinking maybe I'd go into medicine. But then the fates decided otherwise, and next thing I knew, I was joining the LAPD. And this would have been.
You know, I should point out that all of this story is about Steve Hodel. There's almost nothing about Elizabeth Short in here. It's all about Steve. Everything happens to Steve. I found out this. I found out that. Yada, yada, yada. It's all about Steve.
63, I actually went through the police academy, and from there graduated and
new breed
worked uniform patrol with LAPD for 6 years, then went into detectives at Hollywood, worked all the tables there, eventually graduated to homicide. And basically I spent my entire rest of my career, the next 17 years, working as a LAPD homicide detective.
Yeah, let me point out a couple of things. Now, Steve will generally say that there were he had about 300 something solves. He generally says that. Steve Hodel's reputation among his fellow homicide detectives is that he was an okay detective with a drinking problem. That's it. So there you got. And I should point out, we'll get into it maybe later, that Steve Hodel is a complete pariah within the LAPD today.
Out of Hollywood division, which is like you call them precincts. We had 18 divisions in the city at that time, and that was one of the divisions, Hollywood. Over 300 murder investigations.
Yep, see, 300, bingo.
During my career, I had a exceptionally high solve rate. I was running around 75, 80% solves. So I had a great reputation, and
an okay detective with a drinking problem. That was Steve's reputation in reality.
And basically retired from LAPD in 1986.
Oh yeah, and then he's going to go up to Washington to raise his kids, get out of the mess that's at Los Angeles, right?
After almost 24 years, became a private investigator, had a couple of sons, and at that point decided to get out of the mean streets of LA, and my boys were like 5 and 7, and went north to Bellingham, Washington, and became a PI, criminal defense investigator.
That's pretty typical. That is the typical arc for retired detectives. If they go into private investigation, they usually work for the defense and point out crummy police work. I know, shocking, crummy police work, right? Yeah.
And kind of became it was a small town just near the border of Canada in Washington State. And raised my boys there, and basically got that 3 a.m. phone call.
Oh, this is where Dad dies. Okay, Dad dies, and he's going to go down, and he's going to find the address books. Now, what's going to be interesting is if he said that his father committed suicide or died of natural causes. Steve now says that his dad committed suicide. Well, let's see what Steve's version was in 2016.
Was at that time he was living in San Francisco in a high rise.
Oh, now is Steve going to say that his dad lived in the penthouse of this building that had a view of Mountain View Cemetery where Elizabeth Short is buried? Because that's a more recent claim. Let's see if he says that, because that's what he says now. And in reality, he didn't live in the penthouse. We have his address. He didn't live in the penthouse. No, sorry.
So you get the call, go back to California, and you meet with your father's widow, June. There, you're pretty much assigned the task of going through your father's personal belongings.
Here comes the photographs. And I should point out, because I have George Hodel's, the probate of his estate, and he didn't handle, Steve did not handle the disposition of the estate. It was somebody else. Reality is a tough mistress, Steve.
Belongings he had actually asked his wife to destroy after he had died. And one of those things was a small photo book. And one photo in particular.
Now, this is going to be interesting, because Steve's more recent claims are that this is a Man Ray photo of Elizabeth Short, or that his dad took it after she was dead. I mean, I think the latest claim that Steve has is that this is a post-mortem photo of Elizabeth Short, and in reality, it's not Elizabeth Short. Steve will go on and on about German facial recognition software. Okay, Elizabeth Short's family says that's not her. Okay, it's that simple, and Steve will talk his way all around it. Okay, bring it on.
Killer inside kind of sets things in motion for you, doesn't it?
It does, and maybe it would be best to give your listeners some background on my father. He was
remarkable man, genius, child prodigy, playing concerts at Shrine Auditorium, sexually precocious. Here we go.
Without question, the most remarkable man I've ever known in my life. And his background was so varied and so eclectic that you really, to understand what comes next, you really kind of have to understand the man himself. And if you like.
Now, Steve generally, in talking about his dad, says, oh yeah, my dad was this nerd, he was this outcast, he was shunned, but he was also bonking. Well, who was he bonking? Was it a professor's wife? Was it a friend's wife? I don't really know. Steve has been reporting this story for years, and lately posted on his blog, hey, is this true? Have you ever heard of this professor? Have you ever heard of this wife supposedly moved back east? Have you ever heard of the kid who was supposedly named Folly? Do you know if any of this is really kind of true? Stuff he's been saying for years. Okay.
His background.
Absolutely. So let's start with your father.
Okay, so George Hodel was born in Los Angeles
1907.
in 1907.
Yeah.
He was an only child.
Yeah.
Born in downtown LA at Fifth and Olive, of all places, Clara Barton Hospital. His parents were Russian Jews. My grandfather, George Sr., was born in Odessa, and my grandmother was also born in Russia, and they met in Paris.
Yeah, George Sr. was a real estate speculator and a financier, and so the George Hodel's dad, Steve's grandfather, had money. And remember, he's the one who owned the Souden house, not George Jr., not Steve's dad. It was Grandpa.
The turn of the century, my grandfather fled Russia just as he was about to be called into service for the army, and he managed to get out because Jews were treated almost like slaves in the service at that time, at the turn of the century, and he managed to escape on a train.
Why is Steve laughing about that? Why is Steve laughing about Russian persecution of Jews? Why is that? Is that funny? I don't get it. There's so many things I don't understand about Steve Hodel. What is funny about persecuting Jews? I don't get it, Steve. Not funny to me.
Dressed up, got fancy luggage, and said he was visiting his sick grandmother, and got out of the country, went to Paris, where he actually met Esther, my grandmother, who was there as a dentist. Very unusual. You imagine a woman dentist in 1901 Paris.
Right.
Very unusual, brilliant woman. Anyway, they fell in love and got married. Came through Ellis Island about 1902 or 3, and came out west to Los Angeles. We're in New York for a year or two. Then they came west to L.A. And George was born in 1907. Quickly, at age 6 or 7, he was identified as being highly gifted. He was a musical prodigy.
No, that's not true. That's not true. The reality is that Georgie Jr. was a piano student, and he played a piano piece at Shrine Auditorium during a long day of boring speeches to kind of break up the monotony. That's the truth. If you know anything about Shrine Auditorium, it is a big barn of a place that seats thousands of people. And we're talking about the old one that burned down, not to be confused with the new one. But it was built for a Shriner convention. It was huge. It sat thousands of people. The acoustics in there were atrocious for a piano recital. Really? Come on. No, Georgie played a piano interlude during a day of boring speeches. That's what really happened. The end.
Playing his own piano concerts at the Shrine Auditorium at the age of 9, beating out adult pianists.
What? What are you talking about? Beating out adult pianists? There was you know, as often as I listen to Steve Hodel, he always surprises me. No, this was not a piano competition. Little Georgie played a little piano piece during a day of boring speeches. That's what happened, and that's it. Period.
Highly gifted, musical genius. They then soon discovered that he was also intellectually.
Steve is, now it's interesting, Steve is probably going to talk about Georgie's IQ. Now, George was part of Louis Terman's study. Steve generally says that his dad's IQ, well, first of all, it says his dad's IQ is 1 point higher than Einstein, which is ridiculous because guess what? Einstein never took an IQ test. It's all speculative. But even there, we have IQ creep. Steve, for a long time, was saying that his dad's IQ was 186. But in a recent interview, he said it was 187. It's like, Steve is just terrible with numbers. I can't believe he was a cop. In reality, the Terman records are online if you know where to look. And George Hodel's IQ was about, if I recall correctly, about 151. You know, if you buy the whole idea that IQ tests have any kind of validity and aren't biased in favor of economic advantaged people, okay, bring it on.
Superior, tested out at 186 IQ.
What did I tell you? Now it's 187. 1 point higher than Einstein. 1 point. Come on, Steve, you can do it.
1 point.
Oh, and I forgot. It skips a generation. Here comes Steve's joke. Are you ready? Be sure to laugh.
Of Einstein. Incidentally, that skips a generation. So.
He loves that joke. He tells it every time.
But my boys are in good shape. Anyway, he went to South Pasadena Junior High, graduated there at the age of 14, and went to Caltech, which was one of our top technical universities.
Wait a minute. He graduated from junior high and went directly to Caltech? I think he was in South Pasadena High School, Steve. Pretty sure.
Universities here in.
Wait, you know, because George Hodel had to write weird things in the South Pasadena High School yearbook and in the literary magazine. So it's kind of weird that Steve just takes him from junior high and puts him in Caltech. But however he works it, it's like pretty soon Georgie is going to be bonking the professor's wife. That comes next.
Highly respected in Pasadena. So he's enters Caltech at the age of 14, and
I think it was 16. Anyway.
Not only is he intellectually gifted,
sexually precocious. Come on, I've got it in my bingo card, man. Come on, come on.
And musically a musical prodigy, but he's also sexually precocious.
Yeah.
Has an affair with one of the professor's wives at Caltech.
Yeah. Only now Steve says, hey, is this story true? Has anybody ever found this story? Do you know who she was? Next is coming up. George followed her back east, and she says, George, you're a child yourself. Incoming.
When he's 15, and she gets pregnant. That breaks up her marriage. She goes back east to the East Coast and has the child.
Names it Folly. Folly.
George follows her back and says, I want to marry you.
George, you're a child yourself.
I love you. And she says, George, you ruined my life. You're a kid yourself. Go home. Get out of my life. So he comes back, and of course, Caltech says, because of the scandal, he was forced to leave after a year. And he hooks up, and he becomes a cab driver in L.A. We're now.
Oh, that's right. George Hodel supposedly becomes a cab driver with William Parker, who was a cab driver, future chief of police, and they become hot buddies, supposedly.
Into the early 20s, mid 20s, and he gets a job. He passes himself off at 17. Is 21, gets a chauffeur's license.
Oh, wait a second. Now we're going to have to get into him being a reporter for the LA Record, which was a major Los Angeles paper. Okay, not really. It was a little nothing paper. Okay. Steve's got the chronology screwed up because he's got his dad being older as a cab driver, but he's got to work in the part about his dad being a reporter. Okay. Come on, Steve. It's your story.
Driving yellow cab, and then he gets a job with one of the.
Oh, he left out William Parker. Oh, Steve. Wow, this is interesting. Okay.
Top LA newspapers, the LA Record,
which the LA Record was a little nothing paper, and long story short, reporters in those days didn't get bylines. There's absolutely nothing to show that George Hodel ever wrote a single word for the LA Record. He doesn't have even one byline. So unless Steve has my dad's clips, here they are with I wrote these. It's BS.
Here in LA and becomes a crime reporter. And he's writing around. This is during Prohibition. He's writing around.
Now let's see. Steve's part usually says that either they arrest a judge with a young blonde or they arrest a judge's wife. It kind of varies. So we'll see what he says, and then he'll talk about the ace of spades being left not next to a body. Now, if you go through the clips of the LA Record, which are online, and I have checked all of this stuff, you will not find anything about a judge or a judge's wife arrested, and you certainly will see nothing about the ace of spades left next to a body. This is all Steve Hodel bullshit.
With the LAPD vice squad, they're kicking doors, and he's going in and
judge's wife.
Taking names and writing these kind of tabloid articles in the newspaper. The judges was seen with a young blonde.
Oh, it's the judge, not the judge's wife. Okay, the judge with the blonde.
Drinking at the bar and stuff. And then he graduates and starts writing around with
ace of spades next to the body.
Homicide, LAPD homicide guys, the big boys, and writes again these tabloid stories on these murders. In 1924-25, does that for about a year or so, and then he starts.
Oh, he left that out. Oh, oh, it's interesting to listen to an old interview with Steve because it doesn't have all those accretions and embellishments. Ah, very interesting. Very interesting.
First double dating with John Huston, who was at that time, of course, not the famous director, but at that time he was just the son of his father. Walter Huston was a very famous actor, stage and screen, one of the A-list actors
That's actually true.
of the day. And he was his son. So Dad and he were friends as teenagers, and they were double dating a couple
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure about that. I have never bothered to look at that. There's only so much time.
of girls, women, young women, teenagers, 18 and 19, and one was named Dorothy, and the other was Emilia. Well, John and Emilia were dating, and George and Dorothy were dating, and then at some point after a number of months they switched, and John fell in love with Dorothy. They ran off to Greenwich Village and got married.
They did get married in Greenwich Village. I'm not sure if they were living in New York at the time. They might have been.
1819, and Emilia.
Wait, didn't Steve say that his dad was in his 20s? Oh,
And George were looking at each other, and I said, I guess it's you and me. She gets pregnant, and George and Emilia go north to San Francisco, where Dad starts medical school, pre-med.
yeah, he didn't start. Yeah, exactly. He's a pre-med student. Yeah.
At Berkeley, 4 years there. He then goes across the bay to UCSF, San Francisco, and to get his MD. And he's going through there, and he gets a job with the San Francisco Chronicle.
That wasn't a job. Those were freelance pieces. He and Emilia, or Emily, or whatever the hell her name was, they wrote a series of about maybe a dozen. They were kind of Sunday feature travel stories about different parts of San Francisco. And that was it. They're interesting stories, you know, it's kind of a bit of color from old San Francisco, but he was never on the staff. That didn't happen.
Newspaper. As a columnist, he has a
No. These were freelance travel stories, feature stories.
joint co-byline with Emilia.
That's
And they're
true.
writing these columns. Actually, it's called Abroad in San Francisco, where they're writing
Yeah, they're essentially like travel stories, but about San Francisco. That's what they are. Yeah,
about stories about different sections of San Francisco and the different ethnic communities and cultures and stuff.
that's all
So
true.
he does that. He gets through medical school, and while he's in medical school, with all of his other gifts, he also has a natural ability as a surgeon.
No, that's not true. The reality is that George Hodel had just enough surgical training to graduate from medical school. He got exactly what all the other medical school graduates had, nothing more than that. And I have the receipts on that. I can break down exactly how many hours of this or that. George Hodel's surgical education consisted in part of taking patients' histories, following doctors around. He wasn't just, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. Nah, nope. Just the basics. That's all he had and nothing more. He specialized in public health.
He has incredible eye-hand coordination. So his professors are vying for him to be their assistant because he's so naturally skilled in surgery. You know, he graduates in 36. Oh, well, before that, he's actually, a child is born to Emilia, which is Duncan.
Yeah, let's talk about Duncan for a minute. Duncan was so ticked off at Steve about what he wrote in Black Dahlia Venture that he stopped talking to Steve. There is a lot of dirty laundry and bad blood in the Hodel family over Steve's claims, and I will leave it at that. Steve wrote the book totally in secret, didn't tell anybody what he was doing, and several of his half-siblings were furious over the claims in that book. Not just Duncan, also Tamar. More about, we'll see when he brings up Tamar. He's got to bring up Tamar at some point.
In 1928. He then has an affair with another woman at the same time, and a second child is born to him by the name of Tamar in 1935.
Okay, let me point out that if you look at Tamar's birth certificate, which I have, it's a matter of public record, no father is listed. We don't know. Officially, her father wasn't listed. Now, based on what happened, yeah, George was probably the father, but there is no father listed on her birth certificate. And her last name was not Hodel. Nope.
He graduates in 36, so he's got these two small children, and he decides to take off, and he gets a job with the U.S. Health Department, doctoring to the...
Wait. What really happened is, because Steve's story is that, oh yeah, my dad got a job as surgeon with a logging camp in New Mexico. And then he did that for a while. And then he was I think he was at the county level rather than the feds. Pretty sure he was like a county health officer. I think that's how it played out. But Steve's getting his chronology a little balled up, it sounds like.
Actually at a logging camp.
Okay. There's the logging camp. Wait a minute. What was he saying about the federal health officer? Okay. The logging camp comes next. Yeah. And let me point out that the medical care in the logging camp is going to be minimal. Anything serious is going to go to a big city where they have facilities to treat people. That's what's going to happen. It's just going to be emergency kind of health, first aid, splinters, cuts, broken bones, stuff like that. And your patients are all going to be young guys working in a logging camp. Okay.
Does that for a year or so. Then he goes and doctors to the Hopi and Navajo Indian reservations in New Mexico and Arizona.
I'm not sure he was on. There was some reservation involvement, but I think it was county. I think he was county-wide.
Arizona does that for a few years, and then comes back.
Now Arizona wasn't involved. It's all New Mexico.
Back to L.A. Joins the health department. L.A.
Oh, Steve is going to say this is where Steve says that his dad was running the health department and he ran very quickly. The reality is that George Hodel was head of the venereal disease department of the public of the county health division. So he never was head of county health. Communicable diseases, that was his specialty. That's what he was doing in New Mexico. There's a lot of things about TB and rabies and stuff like that. That's what he was doing. His specialty was public health, communicable diseases, and that's how he got into VD. He was not ever a surgeon. No.
Health department quickly rises to the top. He specializes in VD, venereal disease control, rises to the top and becomes the VD control officer for LA County.
That's actually more accurate. Steve now says that he was head of the health department. He was just head of the communicable diseases, VD. Yeah, that actually is true.
At this point, Dorothy, John Huston's Dorothy, had been married to him for 7 years. They break up. She comes back, hooks back up with George, and my older brother Michael is born in 39. I come along in 41. Yeah,
let me point out that Steve's older brother was born before they got married. Steve likes to gig Duncan. There's a lot of bad blood in the Hodel family. Steve likes to gig Duncan over, George hadn't married the mom and he was a common law wife, which doesn't exist in California. All that kind of stuff. Yeah, Steve's older brother was born before the folks got married. They got married down in Mexico. But they were married by the time Steve came along.
And my younger brother Kelly is born in 42. So they get married, and Dad buys a Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. home.
It's Lloyd Wright. And George doesn't buy it. His dad owned it and he rented it. That is utter bullshit, Steve. Bullshit.
In Hollywood. It's a Mayan temple. It's been used in quite a few of the films, L.A. Confidential and Aviator, and it's easily recognizable. It's literally a huge stone castle in the heart of.
Yeah, it was this, at the time, it was this weird old house. And we're talking about in the 1930s and 40s. It was this weird old white elephant of a house that was a rental. Okay. It was rented to all kinds of people in and out of there. That's the history for real.
Hollywood looks exactly like a Mayan temple. So Dad is now head of LA County Health.
No, he was never head of LA County Health. He was head of the Communicable Diseases Division, Steve. Let's see, what comes next? We were the three princes. Everything was going swimmingly. I think that's what ought to come next.
DD, he has his children there, and from 1945 to 1950, we have these incredible. He's having these incredible parties.
Now that's utter bullshit. Let me tell you what really happened. George Hodel and Steve's mom had split up. She and the kids were moving all over LA, a very transient lifestyle. They did not live at the Sowden house at all. There were a few times when, in desperation, because she couldn't find anywhere to live, George would let her live there. We find records of that. We also find that she was using the house as a mail drop because she didn't have a regular address. So she uses the house as a mail drop. But there's one interview that she did where she's living over the bait shack on Santa Monica Pier. It's a little more accurate than, how do we know all this stuff? Well, every time she got arrested and charged with child neglect, the newspapers published the address. So we know damn well she wasn't living at the Sowden house. And let me point out that for part of 1946, George Hodel was in frickin' China, okay? But do go on, Steve, with your fantasy world.
The rich and famous are coming, and he's at.
No. There is absolutely no evidence at all in any of the newspapers, society columns of so-and-so gave a party and so-and-so was there. And the newspapers in those days had society pages that covered parties heavily. If he was given parties like that, you would have it written up. Didn't happen. That's the Steve World fantasy.
Entertaining a lot of the film people and a lot of them politicos of the day. And then
now, let me remind you that Steve will say his dad was a killer who hated humanity. So if you hate humanity, do you throw lots of fancy parties for Hollywood people and politicians, really, if you hate humanity? How does his head not explode? How?
In 1949, there's a knock at the door.
Oh, he loves the knock at the door stuff. Now, let me point out, in order for this scenario to work, Steve would have to be living at the Sowden house with the various boarders who were also living there. Let me remind you, it was a rental, and to cover the rent, George Hodel was taking in tenants. Who else was living there at the time? Tamar, allegedly. So you've got George Hodel, a couple of tenants, a housekeeper, Steve's mom and the three kids. I mean, you know, it was overrun with people, supposedly. No, this is Steve World fantasy.
Of our home. And
he didn't live there. Steve didn't live there then. He was living with his mom.
It's LAPD, and they say, Dr. George Hodel, and he says, yes. He said, you're under arrest for incest. They take him into custody. Well, you recall that Tamar, that was born in 35, she's now 14, and she came down that summer to live with us. And
oh, Steve. Now, when you read the accounts of the Tamar incident, there isn't any mention of you. There isn't any mention of your brothers. There isn't any mention of your mom. How did that happen? Okay, in reality, Tamar's an incorrigible girl. She's an incorrigible teenage girl. She is a liar, yes. Everybody in the Hodel family says she is a liar except for Steve. Who says she's a liar? Her mom, her grandmother, her kids. Tamar's kids say, yeah, mom was a liar and manipulator. Only Steve Hodel says she's reliable. Anyway, Tamar's mom was having a terrible problem with Tamar, put her in like a convent because she was this incorrigible teenager. The mom finally says, I can't take this kid anymore. I have had it. I am shipping her ass down to Los Angeles to live with George. Okay, what happens in reality? George is living the single lifestyle. He doesn't want an incorrigible teenage girl around. Tamar's from the Bay Area. She doesn't want to live in LA. So can you see why this would not work well? And let me point out that Tamar had already established a reputation for accusing men of molesting her. It was like her go-to weapon against men was she would accuse them of molesting her. It was very common. So this is where we're heading. And let me point out that Tamar is also going to make molestation charges against 13 students at Hollywood High School, which Steve will never, ever tell you.
She runs away from home while she's living with us, and the police pick her up, and they said, why did you run away from home? And
oh, it's so sad. Oh, boo-hoo. Yeah, Tamar took off, and George, I think it was George, filed an attempt to locate, because she was a runaway girl, as one does. The cops found her because she was a juvenile. She had to be interviewed by the juvenile officers. And Tamar's juvenile status is important because as a juvenile, she had to be treated, she had to be interviewed and handled by juvenile officers. That's what really happened, because Steve isn't going to tell you that either. There's a whole lot about her being a juvenile that Steve just brushes over that is actually important.
Tamar says, well, because my life is so messed up. And I say, what do you mean? She says, well, and then she reveals that her father had sexual intercourse with her with two.
That was never the allegation. That was never the allegation. It was other stuff. But and that was not at all what was depicted in the original news accounts. This is Steve's spin on it.
Or 3 other adults in the bedroom. So big scandal, newspaper articles. Head of LA County Health arrested for.
No, he wasn't. He was not the head of LA County Health. And let me point out, as Steve heads toward this story, that the district attorney had established a team to handle juvenile cases, and they had just won an incest case in which it was, I believe it was a tennis coach who was molesting his daughter, and he got convicted and sent to prison. So they had some experience on that. And in fact, Tamar thought, gee, what an interesting story. I'll kind of base my claims off of this news story. You can learn a lot if you read the newspapers and are a diligent researcher rather than making up stuff, Steve.
Child molestation, incest. Well, Dad, these cases filed in court, and
as no one should be surprised by that. Okay.
He's held to answer, and then there's a jury trial. And
okay, let me point out that the jury trial, the jury consisted of 8 or 9 women. Okay, so it isn't like it was all guys deciding the verdict on the case. It was mostly women. Mostly women. Steve won't tell you that either.
Dad hires Jerry Geisler, who some of your listeners may be.
No. And in fact, it was another attorney in Geisler's office. George Hodel might have talked to Geisler once, but generally it was somebody else in his office who handled George Hodel's case.
Familiar with was the top criminal attorney in the nation at that time. He was kind of the Johnny Cochran of his day. And
well, that's sort of true. That's sort of true, but again, he wasn't George Hodel's lawyer.
He hires him. There's a 3-week trial, and they come back and the jury.
Let me point out that George Hodel, allegedly rich and powerful, had to take out a lien on the Souden house, even though his dad owned it, to pay for his defense. Okay, number one. So many. Okay, do go on.
Comes back in about 45 minutes and kind of an OJ decision, not guilty.
You know, there's a little bit more to that story. The trial was in late December, and I think they sequestered the jury. Pretty sure they did that. The jurors all wanted to go home for Christmas. Who can blame them? And again, everybody said Tamar was a liar except for Steve. They put the mom, the grandma, and about like 8 other people who had known Tamar for years. They all said the same thing. She lies under oath. We wouldn't believe her no matter what. That's what really happened.
With that, Dad, shortly after that, leaves the country.
No, that's not what happened either. George Hodel stuck around for a while. He was trying to find some place who would hire him, because even though he was found not guilty, nobody would touch him. And that was Tamar's goal. Tamar's goal was to get revenge on her dad by making up the story, and she did it. That's what happened. But we need George Hodel to stick around LA a little bit longer so that we can bug his house. He can't go to Hawaii yet.
And goes to Asia. Well, he actually goes to Hawaii, which was a territory at the time.
He stayed in LA and got the house bug, Steve. Come on.
Becomes a psychiatrist, then goes on, remarries, goes on to Asia, and uses Manila, Philippines as his home base, and gets into market research, kind of reinvents himself as a market research genius, becomes the leading authority in all of Asia on market research, which was just kind of born at about that time in the 50s. And has 4 more children, marries a wealthy Filipina. Actually,
Yeah, they hate Steve. The Philippine branch of the family absolutely despises Steve for what he said about his dad. I don't suppose Steve is going to mention that either.
Becomes a senator and has 4 more children. Divorces her after about 5 years. Hooks up with one of his young assistants, secretary, June, a Japanese woman, who will spend the next 30 years with him. So he travels all over the world doing these market research for a lot of the top airlines and hotels and stuff.
I'm not sure how much he was traveling at that point. I'm not sure how accurate that statement is.
Eventually, in 1990, comes back to San Francisco.
Yep.
After 35, 40 years, although he was coming here every year or every 6 months or every year for short trips.
Oh, we need George to come back to America frequently so that he can be Zodiac. Steve will tell you that George was sort of the jet set serial killer and was traveling the globe, killing anybody who needed to be killed, famously, so that Steve could come along later and say, oh yeah, my dad did that one too. Yeah.
Business trips and stuff. He finally relocates to San Francisco in 1990. And I make contact with him. I start seeing him on a regular basis. I'm in Bellingham, Washington. I go down, he comes up, and we develop a very close relationship. At this point,
yeah, Steve's going to talk all over that place. He's going to say, I was very close to my father, but I didn't know him. Welcome to Steve World.
His life, he's got 11 children by 5 different women, and he's living on the 39th floor of a high-rise in downtown San Francisco.
If I really had to, I could look up what floor that was. Steve's usual claim was it was the penthouse. He doesn't say that this time. I would have to check to see what floor it was, if it matters that much. The main thing is, it wasn't the penthouse. And it didn't have a view of the cemetery where Elizabeth Short was buried. No. Um, those may be more recent claims. As I said, Steve changes his story all the time. So I don't know where we are in the invention of Steve World.
So we see each other for the next decade. I spend quite a bit of time with him back and forth. We become quite close. And
Quite close, but I didn't know my dad.
then I get that 3 a.m. call from June saying your father's collapsed. The paramedics are here. They just pronounced him dead. I fly down and start to do what all sons do when they're passing of a parent, and that pulls me into my investigation.
Was it difficult getting close to him? No.
I knew my dad, but I didn't know my dad. Oh, this is good. Another tough question here. Eric, you ask the hard ones, man.
Knowing what he did to your sister, were there ever any conversations about that?
Well, you know, of course, the story was that, I mean, what he presented to the world and to everybody else, including all the other extended family, was that it never happened. That was his position. And that, you know, they painted, basically his attorney painted Tamar as a pathological liar.
Which in fact she was. And everybody in the family says so, except for Steve. And let me point out that one of her daughters, Fauna, when she finally met Tamar, said, "Oh my God, this woman is the hippie of the year." Painting Tamar as the soul of veracity is really, really an uphill battle.
She was making it all up. It was all fantasy. And I was one of the few, and most...
The Hodel family seems to have, certain members of the Hodel family have a lot of trouble with reality. A lot of trouble.
Family members kind of believed it was maybe made up, that, you know, Dad didn't do it. Certainly all of the Filipino family believed that.
Yeah, as I said, the Philippine branch of the family hates Steve for writing this book.
My brother and I both believe that it happened, and because, you know,
But you were living at the Sowden house, right? So you would know. Oh no, wait, you weren't living at the Sowden house. Which is it, Steve? Were you there or not?
I consider myself a fair judge of people, and
sorry, every so often Steve will say something that really just, I'm not prepared for what he's going to say.
Dad was very eccentric, and I knew that he was, you know, obviously, you know, obsessed with sex, and so I was.
But he hated humanity, and that's why he was a murderer, right? Because it was all about revenge. But he was obsessed with sex. Okay.
In full belief, I had never had any doubts that he did commit it, but a lot of others didn't believe it. So it was kind of a mixed bag for Tamar, and and it of course impacted her. Even though, you know, the amazing thing was there were 3 adults present in the room during the sex acts, and they testified in court, and yet he beat it. We would later discover in my investigation that there were indications of a payoff.
No, only in Steve World. Only in Steve World was there a payoff. No.
From what you write in your book, the prosecution had an absolute slam dunk.
No, they didn't. They did not. No.
Witnesses galore, actual witnesses who were there in the bedroom testified, but his defense attorney really pulled off a coup.
Well, he really did, and we also learned that apparently $15,000, and you also got to remember back then in 49.
No, he's going to say everything was corrupt. Nah, not for something like that. No.
LA was a real life LA Confidential.
No, that isn't true at all. That is not true. Not true. No. Because that's the only way Steve Hodel can make his scenario work, is everybody was covering up, everybody was on the take, everybody's lying. And it's like, okay, all these people are lying and you're telling the truth. Or are they all telling the truth and you, Steve Hodel, are lying? I think it's everybody else is telling the truth and you, Steve Hodel, are lying.
I mean, there was a lot of corruption, a lot of the cops, everybody, a lot of the politicals.
No, not like that. Not for that kind of a case. Nope.
A lot of, in the DA's office, everybody was getting payoffs.
That isn't true. None of that's true. And let me point out that the district attorney had just successfully prosecuted an incest case against this tennis coach involving his daughter, and that guy went to the can. They had just won that case, so don't tell me how crooked everybody was, because it's bullshit. No.
So it wasn't all that surprising. And she was this beautiful Marilyn. I mean, you look at pictures of my half sister Tamar, and she looks like a little Marilyn Monroe.
She does. She's very pretty.
And she was absolutely, 14 going on, 25 or whatever. And so
she lived she followed her own drummer. Shall we say, in later life.
Tragically, and her life, because of that, I mean, because of those allegations and that she was labeled and painted with this pathological liar brush, her life kind of spun out of control.
Yeah. You know what? She had been, Tamar had been seen by a psychiatrist. It came out in court testimony, I think, for lying like the age of 7 or 8. I mean, long before she was sent down to live with George. She had a reputation among the family for lying.
And she went to San Francisco and became, one of the original bohemians and hippies and kind of sex, drugs, rock and roll type thing. So I had almost no contact with Tamar really for the first 50 years of our life.
Yeah, that actually is true. That is true. And let me point out that Tamar was really pissed at Steve for what he put in Black Dahlia Avenger until he kind of found a way to assuage her hurt feelings. I won't say more than that. He found a way to calm her down, shall we say?
I mean, we just didn't. She went on to Hawaii and to have 4 children, four children, and all different fathers and stuff. So the only
Tamar was a mess. Okay.
time I really connected with her was after Dad's death. Like 40 years, and then we started talking and comparing notes because she still loved her father.
This is such crap. This guy molested you and yet she still loved him. I mean, really, Steve, come on. This is impossible.
And I had become close. So after Dad's death, in the weeks following that, we started conversations for the first time, and that also contributed. So maybe I'll let your listeners get an idea of what kind of. The point is that this investigation came to me. I didn't go to it.
It all happened to Steve. Everything happened to Steve. It fell in his lap. I was just walking down the street, happily retired, and gosh, shucks, what do you know? It just landed in my lap. And he's going to say that, Tamar told me that Dad was suspected in the Black Dahlia case. And I said, no way. So my mission was to clear my dad. Well, George Hodel was a suspect for about 5.5 weeks and eliminated. So that he had already been cleared. So Steve goes on this mission where he says, well, I'm going to clear my dad, but it's really, I'm going to convict my dad. That's what it's really about. That's his real goal. Because his dad had been cleared.
Oddly enough, I knew very little about the Black Dahlia. I didn't even know the Black Dahlia's name.
Yeah, well, if you didn't know about it, then it didn't happen, right? Oh, this just happened to me. Must be new information.
Elizabeth Short. I knew it was a famous whodunit from the 40s, but as a young homicide detective.
Now, Steve generally says that, Oh, it was we saw the pictures when I was at the academy, and there was this TV movie with Lucy Arnaz, and maybe I was thinking of that. We'll see.
I was concerned with the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Oh yeah, we had Manson going on. I forgot. Oh no, wait. His Manson thing is when Zodiac. Sorry, hard to keep Steve's story straight.
Not the past. And there was never any indication that there was any connection or to my family or anything while I was on the job. It was only 14 years into retirement that I would start to discover things.
So to bring it around again to that pivotal moment, you're going through your father's things and you find this little book of photographs, and as you're skimming through the book, you're shocked to find a picture who you later discover to be Elizabeth Short.
No, it is not Elizabeth Short. Neither of those pictures are Elizabeth Short. It is just Steve showing pictures of some random women saying, see, this is Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short's family says that's not her. And Steve will talk all around it and say, well, German facial recognition software says it's her, but only to a 90-something% accuracy. But it doesn't matter. The pictures are her, but that doesn't matter because it just got me interested in the case. But they're her, but it doesn't matter. But they're her. Yeah, and like that.
Right. So what happened was I go down and June is in, of course, a deep depression. They've been married 30 years. She was suicidal. She was going to take her life.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one before. Now, is Steve going to say that George died of natural causes or that he committed suicide? His death certificate said he died of I think it was heart problems, which of course that's the definition of death, is your heart stops beating. That's what death is. Steve likes to claim that his dad saved up tablets, sleeping tablets or whatever, to overdose and kill himself. So we'll see which version we get this time. And
so I spent, the first few days dealing with that and saying, no, you're younger than me, June. You've got a lot to live for, and kind of talking her through that. And then we're sitting there one evening, and she comes out and she actually hands me this little book that belonged to my father. And it's like 3 by 5 inch book. It was wooden bound. And it had a bunch of pictures in it, small pictures of my mother, my brothers and I, my grandfather. And I'm leafing through this book and turning the pages. And there were photos by Man Ray, who plays an important part in it.
Oh, yeah, he's going to say Man Ray was the family photograph. Now, Steve, in later years, says one of the pictures, a woman recognized herself and said, Steve, that is me. That I remember your dad taking the picture. The other photograph isn't identified. Steve's latest, wild story is that picture was taken after George Hodel killed Elizabeth Short. But of course, nah, it's just goofy. Anyway, do go on.
Story. Who was a famous surrealist photographer, and he was actually our family photographer back in the 40s. And there are pictures by Man Ray of my mother and us boys and stuff. And I'm going through and I look and I see this photograph of a dark-haired young woman.
Oh, Steve likes to say that she's nude or semi-nude, and you can't see anything from the photograph. Maybe she could be draped with fabric. You don't know. But Steve will say, yeah, she's nude or semi-nude, actually.
Semi-reclining, and she was nude. And
you can't tell. You cannot tell from that photograph.
I turned to June and I said, who is this? And she looked at it and she says, I don't know, somebody your father knew from a long time ago. But the face looked familiar, and I think, why do I know this face? Well, it clearly looked like a photo from the 40s. But I couldn't pull it in. And then, for some strange reason, Black Dahlia comes to mind.
For some strange reason, like, I want to write a book and accuse my dad of this so I can say I solved it.
And to this day, I can't say for sure why Black Dahlia came to mind.
I can. Money. It's all about money. It's a grift.
But there was a film in the mid-70s,
Okay, there's Who is the Black Dahlia? Okay.
a television movie called Who is the Black Dahlia?
Yep.
And Lucy Arnaz played the part of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. And the picture was almost picture perfect to her. It looked just like her.
So what you're saying is the picture that you think is Elizabeth Short looked just like Lucy Arnaz playing Elizabeth Short? Because that's what you just said. You didn't say it's Elizabeth Short. You said it's Lucy Arnaz playing Elizabeth Short, which is quite a bit different.
So I'm thinking, well, maybe that was the source of it, because I had seen that movie. But anyway, it just it was a passing thing.
So he'd seen the movie. So he did know something about the Black Dahlia.
But then, 3 or 4 days later, I'm on the phone with Tamar, who's in Hawaii, and I'm talking to her. And we're talking.
Oh, here it comes. Tamar, what are you talking about? I got it on my bingo card.
Talking about Dad and reflecting on memories and what a great man he was and all of this.
Now, hang on. Steve, this guy, your dad, supposedly molested Tamar when she was a teenager, and she's reminiscing about what a great man he is? How does that make sense? That makes absolutely no sense. None. And you're not going to get a question from Eric. He's like, oh, wow, okay, what then? Because these guys ask softball questions. They don't press Steve at all.
And she comes out of nowhere and says, well, he was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder. And I said, what are you talking about?
Yeah! Bingo! Got that one on my bingo card. He's so predictable, except when he's not.
And she says, yeah, well, he didn't do it, but he was a suspect back then in the murder. And I said, where is this coming from? She says, well, when I was picked up by LAPD on the runaway and made my disclosure, they told me, and we were going to court back and forth, they told me that, he was a suspect in the murder.
No, that is not what happened. That is not at all what happened. What happened in reality is that they knew whoever killed Elizabeth Short had advanced medical knowledge. So they looked at anybody with medical training who had been accused of a sex crime. So that's when he only became a suspect when Tamar accused him. That was when, not before that. No. Nope.
And of course, you think, well, why would this have never come up? Well, I don't think I had more than 30 minutes of conversations with Tamar in the previous 50 years. So we had, gone on our separate routes in life and stuff. So anyway, there was that. And then I started looking into it, and I start researching, get online and start looking at the case itself. And the next thing I discover. So that's the first or second.
So is Steve, let's see. I think at some point, well, I don't know. I don't know where he's going to go next. Let's see.
Blinking red light. And then I discover that the crime was committed by a surgeon. Well, Dad was a skilled surgeon.
No, he wasn't. No. That is utter Steve bullshit.
In his early doctoring days. But still, it never occurred to me that he might be.
Okay, let me point out that going from surgery to public health is not how you go in medicine. That isn't how it works. If you become a surgeon, that's it. You are a surgeon for life. You sure as heck don't suddenly, I'm la-di-da, I'm tired of surgery. I'm going to go do communicable diseases. Nah. That's the only person who would fall for that is somebody who knows absolutely nothing about medical training and the medical profession. Otherwise, that is like, you have got to be kidding me.
The suspect, I thought, well, what's the deal here? Well, then what the real turning point was maybe a couple of weeks later. My girlfriend, who's living in Los Angeles, I had her send me up stuff from the LA newspapers, articles, original articles and stuff from the UCLA library. And she sends me one that's a front page and it's a note. Well, turns out the killer, Elizabeth Short's killer, the Black Dahlia, started sending in these notes, cut and paste notes like ransom notes. And
yeah, let me also add that all this time Steve Hodel is investigating his dad. He never called up robbery homicide. Hi, this is retired homicide detective Steve Hodel. Can I see my dad's file in the Black Dahlia case, please? Because you know what? They would have showed it to him. Steve Hodel never asked to see his dad's file, had no interest in seeing his dad's file until after he wrote the book. And so that is one reason that Steve Hodel is a pariah within the LAPD. He didn't want to know. He made this totally out of thin air that his dad was this big suspect. He could have demolished that easily by asking to see the LAPD files. Because I was told by LAPD detectives that, if Steve had asked to see his dad's file before he wrote Black Dahlia Avenger, I would want to see him out of professional courtesy. He never asked. Yeah.
Disguised handwriting and printings and stuff. And he sent in maybe a dozen.
No. Let me also add that sending in crackpot mail in big crime cases was the thing to do in LA, not just in the Black Dahlia case. Any prominent case generated a lot of crackpot mail. Some people were operating in good faith, but there were a lot of pranksters. Very typical, very typical. The original investigators believed that only the first mailing, the first envelope that contained Elizabeth Short's property from her purse was legit. All the others were pranksters.
In the 2 or 3 weeks following her murder, to the press, taunting them, taunting the police, taunting the press, signing it Black Dahlia Avenger. And in one of these notes, most of the handwriting was disguised, but this one note.
Oh, yeah. Steve loves to recognize his dad's handwriting. It's his favorite investigative tool. Oh, I recognized my dad's handwriting. I recognized his MO. Steve will pull that out of his hat all the time.
It wasn't, and it was on the front page of the newspaper, and it said, turning myself in on January 29th, had my fun at the police, signed Black Dahlia Avenger. And I look at the handwriting, and it's my father's handwriting. I mean, no doubt about it. You know your parents' handwriting, your listeners know theirs, and I know my father's. And I still said, well, wait a minute, this can't be. What's the deal here? Is he pretending to be? Does he know the killer? What's going on here? And at that point, I said, I need to follow this up. So at that point, I basically decided to relocate back to LA and do a full bore, realizing I couldn't do an absentee investigation from Bellingham, Washington. And I'd been divorced and stuff, and my boys were off to school and college and out of high school. So I relocated back to LA.
Steve Hodel is going to do a full bore investigation into his dad, except never ask to see his dad's LAPD file. Yeah, which would be the one thing you would want to see, right? No, never asked to see it.
2000 and began my investigation. You'd spend the next 3 years, 2.5, 3 years putting it all together, interviewing people, and eventually I went to the LA, in secret, I went to the DA's office to district head DA by the name of Steve K.
Oh, let's talk about Stephen K, because that's fun. Stephen K was a deputy district attorney, that's true. Stephen K did make a presentation with Steve Hodel to the district attorney at the time, Stephen Cooley. Someone who was in that meeting, who attended that meeting, rolled their eyes all during the presentation, and every time somebody mentioned Steve Hodel would roll their eyes. They thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Let me also emphasize that Stephen K no longer discusses Steve Hodel. Stephen K no longer discusses the Black Dahlia case. The only thing Stephen K has said on the record is that he did not believe Steve Hodel's claim that there was a police cover-up. Didn't believe that. So, when you bring up Steve K, Yeah, it's a little more problematic than Steve would have you believe.
who was one of the top. He was like the number 3 man in the DA's office. He had he was probably the best prosecutor that they've ever had.
Oh, ever? Ever? I wonder what Vincent Bugliosi would say about that. I wonder what J. Miller Levy would say about that. Steve?
He worked with Bugliosi on the Manson murders, and just was a top-notch guy who I totally respected. We met in secret. I gave him all of my files and exhibits and said, here's the evidence, take a look. So he did for a couple of months, got back to me and said, unbelievable. He said,
He said, based on this evidence. Well, of course, Steve's evidence is crap. Crap in, crap out.
Father's still alive. I would file at least 2 counts of murder on him. One for the Black Dahlia murder, Elizabeth Short, in 1947, and then the second one for a murder that actually occurred 3 weeks afterwards, which was a woman by the name of Jean French, which is known as the Red Lipstick murder.
Absolutely nothing in common. Those killings had absolutely nothing in common other than women were the victims, and that's about it. I would love to get Steve Hodel in court. I would love to get Detective Hodel on the witness stand and cross-examine him. That would be a dream come true. I would have fun. Steve would not have fun. I would have fun.
Where she was, beaten to death, strangled, beaten to death, body posed on a vacant lot.
No. I don't think Jean French was strangled. She was hit with something like the handle of a socket wrench and then stomped. And what killed her was the guy stomped her and broke a rib, and the rib punctured the heart. Now, let me point out that there were shoe prints left around her body. The man who killed her was a man, had very small feet. George Hodel had very big feet. It's clearly not George Hodel. Will Steve ever address that? Nope.
It's like Elizabeth Short's 3 weeks afterward.
No, and Jean French wasn't posed. She was found where she fell out of a car. That was it, not posed. Nope.
And the killer used lipstick and wrote a profanity on her body, taunting the police. And actually, what I had discovered, as if it wasn't enough that Dad was connected to the Dahlia murder and the French, but what I discovered was there were a series of lone woman murders that occurred in the 40s, all in a very tight geographical area.
Not a tight geographical area. All of these killings are different. Everyone is different. They are not at all the same, except in the mind of Steve Hodel.
Yeah, in LA, but from Hollywood to downtown, to the west side. About 9.
That's not a tight geographic area. Downtown to Hollywood to the west side, that's not a tight geographic area at all. Unless you have Steve's buddy doing the attack of the 100-foot lone woman murder victims. No.
Murders. And basically, I put each of them together in different ways and felt he was responsible for at least those 9, if not more. So the DA basically says, I would file these 2. At that point, I said, okay, I'll go public with this, and I wrote the book, and it came out in 2003.
I wrote the book, and I went public with it, and I never asked the LAPD to see the file on my dad, because why would I do that? Yeah. Some detective you were, Steve.
And basically, as you know, it gained a lot of publicity. It was featured on Dateline and 48 Hours, and they've done 5 or 6 different.
Yeah, these folks love to do one-source stories. Author says this, author says that, man says this, man says that. There's never any pushback. Nobody really holds Steve accountable for what he says. Nobody is willing to do that. Partly because Steve is very thin-skinned and can't stand to be challenged. And so all he ever gets is softball questions. like Eric here, who is asking nothing but softball questions, when he bothers to ask questions at all.
Our shows on my investigation over the years for the last 14, 15 years now.
So let's talk about Elizabeth Short, who she was, how she ended up in Los Angeles.
Oh, this should be interesting. Steve knows so much about Elizabeth Short. Now, remember, Steve's story is all about Steve. Steve is the victim. Elizabeth Short just happened to get killed to make the story going. That's all. Her function is done. There's practically nothing in here. So let's see what Steve can tell you about Elizabeth Short.
How she was eventually found.
Sure. So Elizabeth Short was a young woman, 22 years old,
Yep.
who came out to Hollywood from Medford, Massachusetts. She was born in Medford, Massachusetts.
No, she was not born in Medford, Massachusetts. She was born in the Boston area. And let me point out, since Steve was never going to do it, the family moved all over the place. They moved quite a bit on the East Coast. It was not at all. She was born in Medford. She grew up in Medford. It was a pretty transient existence.
It was wartime. Second World War was in full swing, and she dropped out of high school and basically came out to LA.
That isn't at all what happened. She did quit school. She had asthma. She had some respiratory problems. So in the wintertime, she started going down to Florida. So that's where she was going. She did not come out to LA immediately. Nope. She was in Los Angeles about 6 months, from late July 1946 to early December, went down to San Diego for a month, came back in early January of 47, and then was murdered. That's the story. She was here about 6 months. We'll say she was here 6 months. And a little bit with her dad, maybe a couple of weeks earlier on, but she and her dad were fighting and she took off. That's all.
To meet Lieutenant Wright. Basically, she wanted to fall in love with a...
It wasn't really Lieutenant Wright. She was engaged to a major, a guy named Charlie Gordon. That's the real story.
Military man during the war, and get married and live happily ever after. And she came out to...
And let me point out, that was a very common theme. There were a lot of young women during World War II who wanted to get engaged, marry to a flyer, somebody glamorous. Yeah, very common.
To Los Angeles, and what...
Are you going to tell us a year here that when she was in Los Angeles, Steve, or are you just going to wing it?
Living in Long Beach for a while. She was dating some servicemen down there, and then she came...
That was in 46. That was after the war was over. Man, Steve is just terrible with chronology. How is he ever a detective? He's terrible.
To Hollywood, and was dating men and stuff, and going to the military, the USOs and stuff. And
hang on here, Steve. I think Steve is talking about the Hollywood Canteen, which, since you asked, was closed by the time Elizabeth Short got to Los Angeles in 1946, which was after the end of World War II, Steve. Man, guy's unbelievable.
Basically, she was kind of naive, young, naive, 22 going on 14 maybe. Not at all ready for the shark-infested waters of Los Angeles and Hollywood. And she dated different guys and stuff. And then on the morning of January 15th, 1947, a woman...
Betty Bersinger walking her little girl, or had her girl in a stroller. Let's see which version of the story Steve tells. In reality, because I interviewed her, she had her little girl in a stroller. But let's see what Steve says.
Was taking a stroller, taking her small child, daughter, to market. And
It's to the shoe repair store, if that matters.
She's in an area called the Lamert Park area of Los Angeles, which is about 5 miles south of Hollywood. And she looks over and she sees this, what she thinks is a mannequin on the vacant lot in this neighborhood. And then she looks closer and realizes that no, it's actually a body. So she quickly goes south to the first home.
Are you going to mention that block is vacant, which is important?
Home, door knocks at nobody home. She goes to another home of Dr. Walter Bailey and his wife. And
we don't know that. We don't know where she went. Betty Bersinger says she thought it was a doctor's house.
She has to use their phone. She calls the police, reports what she's seen. Police respond, and this begins what becomes LA's most notorious murder of the century, and which will become known as the Black Dahlia. Police get there, they're horrified with what they see.
Actually, no. The police are not horrified. You got to remember the first two responding cops, and I interviewed one of them. These guys were World War II veterans. Number one. Number two, have you ever seen a traffic safety film from the 30s and 40s? They are gory. They are blood fests. These cops had seen everything. They really had. And especially the detectives, they had seen all kinds of murder and death and dismemberment. You know, we want the police to be shocked and horrified, but the reality is, no, they weren't. They were not.
See it at the crime scene. There's a body, a woman's body, young woman. She's a Jane Doe, no identification. And the body is carefully posed. It's surgically bisected at the waist.
Mm-hmm.
Skillfully, there's no blood. Clearly the crime didn't occur there. Body has been washed clean.
Yep.
It's a horrendous sight. These are veteran, seasoned homicide detectives there, and they've never seen anything like it.
Oh, yes, they have. Steve, you're full of shit. Harry Hansen, the lead detective in the case, told the grand jury, I have seen many, many dismembered bodies. And if you could see those and Elizabeth Short's, you would see the difference immediately. They had just done Otto Stephen Wilson, who was cutting up women. These guys were hardened homicide detectives. They had seen everything. This is just ridiculous.
Hands over the head are posed in a careful position, in a special position. The lower.
Now that's interesting. Steve likes to say in more recent interviews that it was in the surrender position, but he doesn't say that. Okay.
Torso is juxtaposed just off the sidewalk, just below the upper torso. Signs of extended torture, cuttings to the body, ligature marks on the neck and the ankles and the feet. A hysterectomy has been performed.
No, that's not true at all. Nope. All of her organs were intact. Nothing was missing. That is, in fact, that's ridiculous that Steve Hodel would say that, because that absolutely did not happen. Man.
On the woman, and cuttings. And then when they get to the coroner's office and they do the actual autopsy and protocol, they just discover some horrendous things. She was actually forced to eat feces.
They don't know that either. That's John Gilmore bullshit from Severed. That's what naturally happens to food in the stomach, okay? Or quite possibly backflow from being cut in half. Much more likely.
They found some of her private parts in her rectum, and just on, this horrible, horrible murder, which is really what made it stand out from the others, because of the extreme sadism involved in it. And they estimate that it probably was 3 or 4 hours of torture. And the one thing they were sure of, that this was a skilled surgeon, not some meat cutter, or, that whoever had this had to be a trained, skilled medical doctor, or, highly skilled in anatomy.
That's true, which eliminates your dad, because he was not highly skilled in anatomy.
she was a Jane Doe for just 24 hours, and then they sent her fingerprints back to the FBI. They came back with a name and a positive ID. They learned her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22. She had worked at a military base about 40 miles north of LA, Camp Cook.
Man. North of Santa Barbara. It's currently Vandenberg Air Force Base. Steve is just so terrible with details. I can't believe he was ever a cop. I really can't.
She'd worked at the PX there, store, military store. And with that, they located her parents back in Medford and her mother. And they learned her name was Elizabeth Short, and she was 22. And they started backgrounding, checking her, and they discovered, actually the newspapers were vying for headlines. This actually became one of the most media, it was huge media coverage of 30 days above the fold on.
Yeah, kind of, sort of. It depends. Steve didn't tell you this, but the actual story is that the police used newspaper equipment to send Elizabeth Short's fingerprints back to the FBI. And so when she was identified, then the Los Angeles Examiner got her ID, and that put them way ahead of the other newspapers. Eventually, all the other newspapers got it because the papers all read each other. But yeah, it was the newspapers did interfere with the investigation. There's no question about that. The newspapers behaved shamefully. They did. Not a good day for LA journalism.
All 5 or 6 of the major newspapers here in LA at the time. It was just before, this was before.
Oh, and I should point out when Steve's throwing around above the fold, the LA Times never put the Black Dahlia case on the front page. Only 2 times. Once when they thought they got a guy, and the second time for My Story, which ran in 1997 for the 50th anniversary. Only 2 times in the LA Times on the front page.
Just before television, so to speak, caught on, and it was kind of like the last major print story. And one of the reporters.
What are you talking about?
Called a pharmacy. She was known to hang out, a soda place in Long Beach, and discovered that the military guys there called her the Black Dahlia.
Not sure it was the military guys, but yeah, there was a drugstore lunch counter in Long Beach, and she got that nickname down there. Yes, it was a play on the movie The Blue Dahlia.
And that name came from a film that was out that previous summer called The Blue Dahlia, which was a noir murder mystery. And she would come in there and stuff, and they just kind of named her the Black Dahlia. So you got this mysterious name, the Black Dahlia. You've got this beautiful young woman. You've got this horrible crime, and they all came together to make headlines. And
gee, that sounds familiar. Where have I heard somebody say that before? I wonder.
It just spun on and remained so for the next 30, 60 days, headlines, not only locally, but across the nation. So that's kind of what started the investigation, and it went from there.
The police had a lot of suspects to talk to, a lot of leads to follow up on, because, as you've mentioned, she dated a lot of guys, seemed to be constantly going out on dates at various nightclubs and restaurants, staying in different hotels, staying with friends when she was.
She wasn't necessarily staying in a lot of hotels. She had a somewhat transient lifestyle, but she wasn't staying in a lot of hotels. It was hard to get a hotel room in Los Angeles in 1946, so not really.
Short on cash, which seemed to be frequent. So there were plenty of people to sort through for the police. And in addition, as you've already said, the killer was sending out notes.
Yeah, Eric, let me correct you here. Notes were being sent, but we don't know who they were. We certainly don't know whether they were from the killer. Possibly not. Possibly not. Quite probably not.
To taunt the police and the newspapers. It's just pure chaos. Now, the killer even calls the editor of one of the newspapers one night to chat with him one-on-one, doesn't he?
That's right.
The city editor, the guy's name was Jim Richardson. He was city editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, which was the biggest paper in LA. Did the killer call? Possibly. Jim Richardson certainly thought that it was the killer. Was it in reality? Probably.
City editor receives a phone call from the actual suspect, and the killer says, I understand you're having.
Wait. The actual suspect? We don't know who he was. How could he be a suspect if we didn't know who he was and he was anonymous?
You hit a block, a dead end. Well, maybe I could help you out. And city editor James Richardson was his name. Says, how so? He says, well, how about if I send in some of her personal effects? Maybe that'll help you. And I'll send in a letter and her personal effects, and maybe that'll help you move forward on it. And the city editor signals to his secretary there to try and track the phone call.
Okay, this story is from Jim Richardson's autobiography, which is called For the Life of Me. And let me caution anybody who reads it that it is prone to the same problems of all autobiographies in that time is compressed, and it's also selective memory. Is it accurate? It may be. Is it the complete story? Probably not. There are demonstrably false or misleading things in that autobiography. You have to be very careful when you read it. The general tone of the book was, Jim Richardson was a reformed alcoholic. And the general tone of the book is, I was a better reporter drunk than you were sober, and don't ever forget it. He was not a pleasant man. He was not generally a respected guy.
And the killer says, I think I'll hang up now. I'm sure you're going to try and track my phone. And he hangs up. Well, within 2 or 3 days, the city editor Richardson gets this package.
That's not at all what happened, Steve. It's an envelope, and it arrived at the post office. It had broken open, and it was addressed with cutout letters, but it was at the post office. Richardson never got the dang thing. And that's why you see the photographs at the post office of LAPD fingerprint experts dusting it for prints. No, Richardson never got it. God. It's amazing to me that Steve Hodel can mangle this story so much. I can't believe he was ever a cop.
And it's it's her personal ID card, social security cards, birth certificate, and some photographs from her personal photographs of her with some other guys and stuff, with a note saying, here it is, promise to mail this to you, and here are some of her personal belongings, and he signs it Black Dahlia Avenger.
That is totally not what happened. It's all addressed with cutout letters and says to Los Angeles Examiner and other papers, here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow. There is no handwriting. There is nothing from Black Dahlia Avenger. The Black Dahlia Avenger mail came later. It was a prank. So Steve Hodel has spent the last 20 years chasing, yes, it's sad, a prank.
So Richardson, he kept that secret. Nobody actually knew that the killer called in. He kept it until about 7 years later when he wrote his memoirs, and he has a chapter on that in there. And he says, I'll never forget that soft, sly voice. He says, if he ever calls in again, but he never did. He thought he might call in again, but the killer never did call back. And again, a lot of the taunting notes were cut and paste and stuff.
They don't know any of those were from the killer. The only one they know for sure was from the killer was the one that had her belongings in it. That's it.
And mailed to both the police and the press. It was very active. I mean, hugely active for the first 6 months or so of the investigation. Then it kind of faded off, and every anniversary, like every 5-year anniversary on January 15th, the newspapers would resurrect the crime remains an unsolved and stuff. And then, of course, from there, a number of books were written, fictional books. Probably the most famous is Elroy's Black Dahlia, James Elroy's, which is totally fiction. It has very little to do with the crime itself, except he uses her name, Elizabeth Short, and the location. But other than that, it's total fiction. It has nothing to do with a real story. Decades, there's so much myth arises from it, and they turned her into a prostitute and a junkie and a dope fiend, and all of these, terrible stories were created by hack writers. In fact, I spent a whole chapter in the book.
Like you, Steve? Like you?
Rehabilitating her reputation, because she wasn't a prostitute. She wasn't. She barely drank. She mostly drank soda, cokes, and she was a bit of a tease. She, dated a guy and stuff, but other than that, she, none of the things that were ascribed to her in all of these very dark fictional books and in the films and stuff were true. One of the things that I do in the follow-up version is there are a number of myths that I try and
Oh, this is where Steve is going to say that there wasn't a missing week. He's going to say that all these alleged sightings of Elizabeth Short in the newspapers were legitimate. And of course, obviously, the assumption is that the police never read the newspapers and didn't know that and never checked up on that, which is ridiculous. But Steve has some thing where he's got to insist that there was no missing week, that she wasn't missing for a week. And what is the missing week? Okay, there's a gap between when she was left at the Biltmore and when the body was found, and it's about 6 days, almost a week. Nobody knows where she was. Nobody knows what she did. We don't know. And Steve has, kind of filled that in with alleged sightings that were in the newspapers that were checked out by the cops at the time and eliminated.
If one of the big things that still stands to this day to many people is her so-called missing week.
Yeah, see?
Supposedly from January 9th,
Yep.
She was brought up to Los Angeles and dropped at the Biltmore Hotel, which is downtown at 5th and Olive. Supposedly there's a missing week from the 9th until the body was found on the 15th of January.
Yep.
And legend has it that she walked out the door of the Biltmore Hotel on the 9th and was never seen again, walked into the fog. Well, that's all totally untrue, and I was able in my investigation to locate.
In your investigation, which involved reading old newspapers and assuming that every detail was true without further investigation.
And actually put together 14 different witnesses who saw her during that so-called missing week.
Yeah, all from the newspaper, in the incredible assumption that the cops didn't read the newspaper and didn't check that. In fact, there were more sightings that people don't know about, that the police investigated, that were never made public. They checked out everything. That is total Steve Hodel bullshit.
Hollywood and downtown, and 7 of those 14 actually knew her personally, so they couldn't.
That isn't true either. None of that's true. Nobody who knew Elizabeth Short up to that point ever heard from her again. That is totally untrue. Nobody ever heard from her again. No.
Been mistaken. So I was able to establish that there was no missing week, that actually the last person to see her was an LAPD policewoman.
Yeah, no. This is the Merle McBride story, where some woman stumbles into a bar in Main Street, and anyway, long story short, Merle McBride made that identification based on a description and hadn't seen the photograph of Elizabeth Short. Later on, she was shown a photograph of Elizabeth Short, because that's how the police work. And they said, "Is this her?" And Merle McBride said, no, it wasn't. Steve won't tell you that. He will not tell you that. The amount of lying that he does is beyond belief.
downtown, who talked to her, had a conversation with her. What we do know is that Elizabeth Short, in the last month or so of her life, began running. She was in fear of a man that was going to kill her.
Huh? Last month of her life, Elizabeth Short was living in San Diego with the French family, so I don't know what the hell you're talking about, Steve. What are you talking about?
And she fled to San Diego.
She didn't flee to San Diego. She took the bus to San Diego. Okay. Here's what really happened, because you're never going to get it from Steve. Elizabeth Short told all of her friends, well, I'm going to go up to the Bay Area and spend Christmas with my sister and her husband. Okay? That's what she told everybody. Almost everybody. She didn't communicate that to the sister or the brother-in-law. She didn't tell them, hey, I'm coming up there for Christmas. It was a total story. And so what happened is, well, Elizabeth Short is telling everybody, I'm going to spend the holidays with my sister. And it's not true. So she needs to get out of town. Well, she's not going to go up to the Bay Area. Where does she go? She goes down to San Diego, and that's what happened. She didn't flee. It was just one more place to go.
Spent quite a few weeks down there and then came back.
1 month.
And this policewoman actually saw her on the 14th, the day before the bomb.
Once that policewoman was shown a mugshot of Elizabeth Short, she said, nope, not her.
Body was found coming out of a bar, or she ran out of a bar and said, there's a man in there that's threatened to kill me. The policewoman goes back in, the man's not there, but they get her purse and stuff, and she talks to her. I was actually able to locate that woman. Imagine 50.
Imagine that, talking to the wrong person, or the person who was wrong, rather.
Years later.
Wow.
That retired, that was one of my most amazing interviews, was with this actual policewoman who.
I talked to one of the first police officers on the scene. He wasn't shocked. So there.
Was the last to see her alive before the murder.
That wasn't Elizabeth Short, dude.
And there was no doubt in her mind. I mean, it's not like this might have been Elizabeth Short. This was Elizabeth Short.
Yeah, no, she talked it back. She walked that one back, Steve.
So that was one of the myths, was this missing week. The second myth that came along was the department's position was it was a standalone murder, none before, none after.
That's true. There is nothing like it. There is absolutely nothing like it. That doesn't suit Steve Hodel's purposes, because he has to connect all these killings that have nothing in common, except that he wants his dad to have done them all. That's the only thing. The only thing they have in common is Steve Hodel wants them to all be the work of his dad. You know, his evil genius dad who committed every unsolved murder on the planet. Yeah.
One of a kind, totally untrue. And as we've talked a little bit about the Lone Woman murders, there were at least.
There are not. They are all different. They're all different.
9 that I'm absolutely considered definites. 2 of those, of course, I mentioned that Kay said he would file. He liked the other ones, and he said there's not enough there to actually file, except on the 2. Anyway, there was a bunch of these murders that, and it wasn't like Steve Hodel was just saying this. It was
Steve Hodel is just saying this.
Actually, LAPD at the time, back then, was actively investigating these as related.
If anything, they were investigating whether they were. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they were sure that they were related, because they were all different. They were different by mode, by victim, by circumstance. Crime scenes were all different. You really can't say that. No, they're all different.
They didn't have the term serial murder back then, but serial killer. But they called them, what was it they called it?
Chain murders.
Called them chain murders.
You got that from me too.
And they were definitely, they definitely had many of them, 4 or 5 of them connected. They even put out in the newspaper, they printed a 11-point paper on why they believed any of these were connected, listing.
Which newspaper and when did it run, Steve? I want details.
11 points of why they believed was the same suspect. So again, that was another myth that
They're all different. They are all different.
became, was lost over the decades. And the other, and this we can get into later perhaps, is that the LAPD never solved the crime. And of course,
Oh yes, here's the thing with Steve World. In order for his little scenario to work, he's got to prove that the cops knew who it was, but they were inept or corrupt. And that's Steve's claim. Police weren't inept and they weren't corrupt. The Black Dahlia investigation was state of the art for 1947. Absolutely was. They did everything right. Hundreds of men were involved in some portion of this investigation, not just the LAPD. They borrowed, they had guys from the Sheriff's Department and from Highway Patrol doing huge sweeps of neighborhoods. Now, it was a huge investigation.
they did solve the crime, and that's a whole section in itself that we would discover after my book comes out. So normally, what was interesting about this case in my investigation was that normally in all my other murders, you start with a kind of a clean plate, a tabula rasa, if you will, and you move forward. Well, with this, I had to, separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out what was real and what wasn't, because there was
You did such a good job of that. You threw out what was real and kept what was fake, Steve. Yeah, that's what you did.
so much myth and legend stacked upon it. I had to kind of clean the
I had to kind of make some more, all involving my dad.
plate, so to speak, before I could move forward.
Yeah.
So that added a unique twist to my investigation, which lasted, well, the first part of it lasted 3 years.
So as the police investigation continues, a man suddenly steps forward, claiming to be the murderer of Elizabeth Short. Newspapers, of course, trumpet the confession in their headlines. You write in your book that this confession from this kid might actually have been the catalyst for the red lipstick murder, a murder that you already talked about, the victim, Jean French. Can you talk about that connection?
Absolutely. So January 15th of 47 was the Black Dahlia murder, and the body was found.
Yep.
And then 3 weeks later, as I mentioned earlier, there was this body of Jean French that was found in West LA, which was about 5 miles west of the.
That's actually true. It was in West LA. I wonder if Steve is going to get into the whole thing, because he's got this whole thing about the street where Jean French was allegedly found. That's the name of the cemetery where Elizabeth Short is buried. Now, that's not really the name of the street, but Steve has, kind of, he does this map torture. And I don't know if he's going to get into it. This was an old interview, so maybe he hadn't gotten so goofy at that point.
Dahlia crime scene, almost in the same parallel spot, directly west 5 miles.
Yeah.
And the body was found on a vacant lot. It was nude, covered with her clothing. She wasn't surgically bisected, but she was had been strangled and beaten to death with probably a tire iron.
I'm not sure she was strangled. She was beaten with, they described it as the handle of a socket wrench. Could be a tire iron, something like that. And also stomped. Did I mention that she was stomped? Did I mention the killer left shoe prints all around her body? Did I mention that his shoes were very small, indicating that the guy wore small shoes and therefore wasn't George Hodel, who had big feet and wore big shoes? Did I mention that? Because you're never going to hear it from Steve. You won't hear it.
And the obscenity was written in lipstick. It was F-U, black inside BD, for obviously Black Dahlia.
It was actually fuck you PD, not BD. It's a little hard to see in the photographs, but the official reports all say that it was fuck you PD, not BD. That's the real story. That's what it really says.
And what had happened was there were a lot of confessing, what they were calling confessing Sams back then. People wanted their 15 minutes of fame, and they would say, I killed Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. So they were running around trying to interview and talk to these various false confessions. And then they got a guy in a military base back east, Private Dumas.
He was a corporal. Come on, Steve, you're in the military. This is a guy who was, I believe it was at Fort Lee, New Jersey. And I think that's where he was. Fort Dix? Anyway, he got in some trouble appropriating money that belonged to somebody else. And so he confessed to the Black Dahlia killing. And they had the local cops interview him, and the local cops really didn't do a great job. He looked like a suspect for a while and then was eliminated. And interestingly enough, in later life, every time he got arrested, he would tell the cops, whoever arrested him, that he killed the Black Dahlia, and they finally said, oh, him again. That's what really happened.
And he claimed he killed her. And the military police back there interviewed him, and he wrote out like a 25-page confession. And LAPD jumped on it, and as you say, it was 6-inch headlines in the newspaper.
6-inch headlines? Joseph Dumais was in the news for about a day or two until the cops eliminated him, and it's like, nah, he's not it.
Private Dumas confesses, or Corporal, I guess he was, Dumas confesses to killing the Black Dahlia. They had this lengthy confession, all in print and stuff. It was huge, and case solved. And basically, 2 days after that appeared, and LAPD kind of went along with it. And
I think they were skeptical since they didn't interview the guy. They were pretty skeptical of it, and they eliminated him.
What had happened was one of the mystery writers, well-known mystery writers of the day, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he wrote into an article into the newspaper because they were asking different experts on their opinions on.
Yeah, the Los Angeles Evening Express, the Herald Express, had as features, because the Herald Express did a lot of they liked crime news, and so they had a bunch of mystery writers, Hollywood writers speculate on who killed the Black Dahlia. And so Steve is trying in his own way he is approaching that subject, but that's what he's talking about.
The Dahlia murder. And this one mystery writer wrote in saying, basically what I would do if I were the police, I would claim that we've got a confession from a man, and he's confessed to the crime. He says this would so enrage the real killer that he would turn himself in to give himself up because he didn't want someone else claiming his murder. Well, unbelievably, the newspapers actually 3 days after this article, they did exactly that.
But people thought Dumais actually killed the guy, and it took a couple of days to sort out that no, he's just lying. The Black Dahlia case inspires lots of people to lie. Shocking, isn't it?
They knew that this Dumas was not
Dumais,
the true killer because the LAPD had established he was actually in his military base back east at the time of the murder. But they went ahead and printed this anyway, following this mystery writer's advice, thinking maybe the killer would turn.
That is not at all what happened. The newspapers ran with the story thinking that the guy did it. It took a day or two to eliminate him. So no, that is not what happened at all. No.
Turn himself in. So what does the killer do? Does he turn himself in? No. What he does is he commits a murder. And this is in response to the so-called confession. He writes on the body, F-U-B-D. And it's in
no, it says F-U-P-D, not B-D. As much as the photograph looks like B-D, I have to admit the photograph looks like that. People who saw the body at the time said it was PD. There you have it.
Response to their claiming.
And I should mention that Steve Hodel will tell you, I recognized my dad's handwriting from what was scrawled on Jean French's body in lipstick. Oh yeah, slam dunk, that's my dad's handwriting. Steve, it's Steve Hodel's favorite tool. I recognize my dad's handwriting. It's everywhere.
You know, rather than turning himself in, he just kills again to prove they've got the wrong killer.
You know what? Time out for a fact check. Let me see when Joseph Dumais. Okay, I'll have to make a note of that and come back, because I don't recall when Joseph Dumais' confession was. I'm not sure that Steve's got his chronology right, and dealing with Steve as long as I have, he's very bad at chronology. Terrible. So let's see.
So that was pretty shocking, and the handwriting on the body.
I recognize my dad's handwriting.
We haven't talked a lot about the evidence, but one of the things I did was I had a court-certified handwriting expert analyze my father's handwriting against many of the Dahlia mailings.
Yeah, but none of those mailings are from the killer. It doesn't matter. It's meaningless.
And along with this one on the body, which was very clearly printed, and very unique, again, my father's unique printing. Anyway, she came back with highly probable that George Hodel wrote the message on the body. And basically, this was his way of again, taunting the police by killing again. He would do it in other ways and other forms later on.
Okay. Time out. Time for a reality check here.
And then there's a whole bunch of other things that ties into it.
Okay, I just took a break for a reality check, a fact check. The stories about Dumais were in the papers on about February 9th, which means it was one day earlier, which was February 8th. And Jean French was killed on the 10th. Cause and effect? Not so certain about that.
Car that was Jean French was last seen was identical to his 37 Packard, black Packard, with strip.
I don't think that's right either. I'd have to go back and look at some of my Jean French stuff. And you know, how many Packards were in Los Angeles in 1947?
He was seen eating with her at a restaurant at Lake.
George Hodel was? George Hodel was seen with Jean French? No. That's Fantasyland. That's Steve World. No.
Around midnight that night before did his description.
A guy. She was seen with a guy. We don't know if it was George Hodel. He was never identified as George Hodel. That's not true. No.
Perfectly on and on, a whole bunch of reasons why. I just couldn't believe that that the newspapers would actually knowingly do this, and in a way you could say they were.
That's because they didn't. That didn't happen.
Directly responsible for the tragic murder of a woman.
How do you find that funny? You know, Steve Hodel laughs at really, really weird stuff, like Russian persecution of Jews is funny. This is funny. I don't get it. I really don't get it. It's weird.
Just because they were following this crime writer's crazy idea of getting it.
You know, I'd have to go back and see when that article was written, because I forget now. I'd have to go back and check. I don't want to take the time to do it now, but I'd be very curious about that. I'd be very skeptical. And it pays to be skeptical of Steve Hodel.
To confess.
So this episode today with Steve Hodel covers a good part of his first book, The Black Dahlia Avenger. Although, of course, there's a ton that we were not able to cover in this week's episode. So this interview will continue next week, and in it we talk about some...
In which Eric will ask more hard-hitting questions like, Oh, and oh, what other stuff did your dad do?
The evidence Steve has gathered that points to his father George as the killer of the Black Dahlia and other murders as well, murders in other cities even.
Yep, George Hodel was the jet set serial killer.
Their countries. We discuss motive too. So stick.
Oh, George Hodel hated humanity, right? Right. No.
But my suggestion, if you want to continue to learn more about the murder,
Buy my books, buy my books, buy my books.
And the investigation, is to sign up for a free audible.com trial at www.audibletrial.com.
Oh, it is not buy my books. I beg your pardon.
Mono, by the way, is short for Most Notorious.
Haha.
M-O-N-O. It's not pronounced mono. A disease that I do not have. You'll get a free audio book with your 30-day trial, and
yeah, I don't care about any of this
Black
crap.
Dahlia Avenger is available as that
Buy
free
my
audiobook.
books.
20 listening hours worth of information about Steve Hodel's brilliant investigation, which should keep you busy until next week.
Should keep you, give you seasickness until next week.
We talk about some of the more recent evidence not covered in the first book. So there. That's
So there.
for your weekend, and you can feel good knowing you've helped me and my little one.
Bye. And that is enough of Eric and his softball questions from Most Notorious for now. Will I do part 2 later? I don't know. You can see the sun is shining, it's not raining, and we're done. And if you get to this far in the recording, you get a gold star. Okay? So long for now.